We are proud members of the Spy Podcast Network. Find out more at www.spypodcasts.com.
Hello and welcome back to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur.
And we're continuing our journey into Munich, the Edge of War, the 2021 Netflix World War II film. And we are back with a SpyMaster interview. Cam, who are we talking to?
We are talking to the writer of the film, Ben Power.
Yes, it's a really fascinating chat with Ben, very insightful, and we hope you enjoy. So without further ado, Cam, roll the interview. And joining us now on the show, it is the screenwriter of this week's film, Munich, The Edge of War, and of course, playwright and the associate director of the National Theatre. It is Mr. Ben Power. How are you doing today, sir?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
So with these interviews, what we like to do is try and have people on the show who have been involved in the films that we talk about, from writers to directors to actors, and just sort of help contextualize the creation of the film and sort of go through the process where you were involved. But I think before we do that, the question I always like to sort of ask is, how did you get into, obviously you don't just do screenwriting, you do a lot of things, but I suppose your work in theatre, how did it all start for you?
Yeah, I came from a theatre background, so I was writing plays and producing plays written by other people at different theatres for a long time before I did any screen work at all. And I was always I love film, and I was sort of, I was a film fan before I was a theatre fan, but I'd ended up doing stage work. And then I had wanted to find a way to write for film and make films. And I got the job adapting some Shakespeare plays for the BBC in 2012. There was a season during around the time of the Olympics and the Cultural Olympiad. They did a season of big Shakespeare history plays on the BBC, and I adapted them, which was a great first job for me because they were plays that I knew really well from the theatre, and the question of how to make those plays work as films was really like an interesting technical challenge, and taught me a lot about storytelling on screen and the differences between the two medium. And I loved it. And I was really excited by the possibilities of telling story on film. So since then, I've done a lot more. And now nearly all of my time is taken up writing films and TV, and thinking about how to, just make the most in storytelling terms for an audience of, the amazing possibility of this art form. And I love it.
And this is the Hollow Crown. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. The Hollow Crown was
with Jeremy Irons, with a nice little connection to this week's film.
Jeremy, exactly. That was when I first met. That was when I first met Jeremy. I'm just trying to think. I don't think anyone else in Munich was involved, but it was like that. The cast of that was like a kind of who's who of people working in British theatre and film at that time. So we did Henry V with Tom Hiddleston, and Ben Whishaw was Richard II, and they're really great movies. And a lot of people, there were a lot of first-time film directors coming from theatre to work on them. And actually, Sam Mendes, who I then worked with on this play, the Lehman Trilogy that we've just done, was the executive producer and kind of ran the whole thing. So it was Sam's brainchild, really. And that was where I first met Jeremy. And I feel like, I've said this before, I feel like even then, in 10 years ago, and before Robert Harris had published the book Munich, I think Jeremy was talking about Chamberlain and thinking about Neville Chamberlain as somebody he was really interested in one day playing.
Well, I believe also that congratulations are in order, because I just read yesterday that the Lehman Trilogy is it the most Tony-nominated play of the year?
Yeah, it's a lot of nominations. Thank you. Yeah, it's really fantastic.
That's terrific news. So well done.
Well, it's great when these things are such collaborative efforts particularly like a play like that, it's every element of, from the design to the music to the video design to the performances, is working together. So, you know, when you get a recognition for a lot of those different departments, it's really great. Yeah, fantastic.
And I'm really curious, you know, you say you were really into film early on. What were the movies that first touched you, the ones that made you actually interested in eventually writing for film?
I mean, I loved, I mean, this is going to sound like an easy answer in the context of your show, but I loved Bond from like the first, it's the first thing I can remember watching, like the Roger Moore Bonds, and watching them with my dad on like Sunday on ITV, and, you know, hating the ad breaks in Man with the Golden Gun or Live and Let Die. Like, those films are so embedded, and actually, you know, when Sam was making Spectre, and we were taught, you know, and they had a very kind of complex script process for that film, which you might know. We were working on the play at that time on Lehman Trilogy, and so I was like talking to him a lot about Spectre, and it's just like I was reminded then that Bond and those movies, because like I love big movies, I've always loved like big action movies, but I guess you try and find things with like a kind of intelligence behind them, and I always thought, and I still think, and you know, the No Time to Die is the proof of this, that the ability of the Bond franchise to like maintain a kind of intelligence and a coherence, even in spite of all the nonsense and all the difficulties of making those kind of films and films of that scale nowadays, it's just incredibly impressive. And yeah, and so the more I know about the industry, the more impressive I think what Barbara and Michael do with the Bond brand and legacy is. But those were the films that I was into really early and for a long time.
It's an interesting question we might come back to, I think, actually later on.
Yeah.
With the Bonds.
Okay.
I was just checking something up because I wasn't sure if I read this correctly, but I went back to look at the Hollow Crown and I realized that Dominic Cook had directed 3 of the episodes.
Yeah,
he's already been on the show before, so we've had you both now.
Yeah, I know. I actually saw him about 3 days ago, and I said I was doing this, and he told me that he had already met with you guys. Yeah, exactly. So, but those episodes, because we wrote the scripts together for those 3 parts of the Wars of the Roses, and then Dominic directed them, and that was his first film directing. And you know, we were kind of learning together, and we just had, you know, a wonderful time. And he worked, you know, Benedict Cumberbatch was Richard III in those films, and you know, they made the career. Yeah.
Well, I think then let's start to chart the course into Munich. We've got this underlying love of spy films here, which we found, which is great, and I want to explore later. But how did the concept first come to you about adapting the book of Munich?
So I was approached. I knew of the book, but I hadn't read it. I'd read other Robert Harris books. And then I was talking to a guy called David Cossey, who used to run Film 4 and is now a producer at Netflix. And one of his jobs at Netflix has been the expansion of European material, not in the English language. So I think it's okay to say this. I think there is a sense that, and you know, I think this has been borne out by events since we made our film. There is a limit to the scale of the English language audience that Netflix can attract. But at this time, this was like 3 years ago, I guess, when we were having this conversation, maybe 4 years ago. There wasn't much that they were making in German or French or Spanish, and David was charged with coming in and building a slate of projects that were either not in the English language or in more than one language, and to find stuff that could be that could attract audiences to Netflix in Spain and France and Germany and Italy and beyond. And since then, of course, like shows like Money Heist and Lupin, and you know, there's a whole range of stuff has just like Call My Agent, you know, very, very successful stuff that sort of proved what I always thought instinctively, and I think lots of people did, that if the material is the right kind of material, stuff that is made in one language can easily translate into another. And there was a lot of conversation at the beginning of Munich about whether we were really going to have the Germans speaking in German and subtitle the English scenes for the German audiences. And one of the successes of the film, I think, is that no one ever talks about that. Like, it's just accepted that everyone's talking in their own language, and that you get interesting things where people have to choose which language they're talking in. Like when Hugh and Paul are meeting, they could talk in two different ways, and the decision is a conscious one. So David was looking for material which would enable him to build an audience in those two, both in non-English language and in the English language. And so he had found Munich, this book that takes place in Germany and Britain with German protagonists and British protagonists, as a potential project that could bridge those two audiences and have a collaboration between British artists or English language artists and German artists, which, by the way, is like the best thing about the film in terms of my experience of it, was having this great close working relationship with Christian Schwoko and with the German actors and all of Christian's team. It was just fantastic. And yeah, so he gave me the book and asked me if I would think about adapting it, and I read it and really loved it, and we started there.
Did you have any contact with the author, Robert Harris?
So I met him. He was great because he's very experienced in adapting. His book's being adapted for screen. He's written the screenplays of several of those adaptations himself. So he was really available and answered lots of questions, very patient, but also hands off, and let us really make the decisions we wanted to make, and then came in and gave very clear steers on where he thought it was working and not. Particularly in the film was very, very long at the beginning of the edit. It came down a lot through the post-production process, and that was interesting and complicated, and he was really useful actually in terms of intervening at crucial moments and pushing it towards the shape of the film that exists now. And he's very, very, very experienced academic. He knows more about Chamberlain and this moment than I will ever know. And actually, all of that research and all of that work is in the book. It was an interesting thing, is that I didn't need to spend very much time away learning myself. Lots of additional, because I love research. It's like one of my favorite bits of the job. But actually, it's all there in the book and in the notes that he made around the book. It's all available, and it's incredibly, even though elements of it are fictionalized, obviously it's an incredibly, I think, accurate. The detail of what is being portrayed is really accurate, even though I know some people have different opinions about Robert's take on this moment and on Chamberlain's behavior. It's definitely rooted in historical fact.
Well, I suppose then you've been given this book to adapt. You like what you've read. You're starting the process of turning it into a screenplay. At that stage, are you looking at any other films that as sort of inspiration you're drawing from? Because this is quite the spy thriller. This is like Le Carré, that sort of stuff. It's going down that vein, but also historical at the same time, and sort of like a biopic in its own way. Was there anything you were drawing from?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things. I mean, I love Le Carré, and that thinking about that kind of. I think one of the things that the film is about moral courage versus moral ambivalence, and what heroism means in these different contexts. And Paul Hartman's idea of heroism is quite different from Hugh Leggett's sort of quieter idea of what your responsibility is in these moments. And so, there's lots of interesting, particularly in thinking about German and British relationships, films like, I guess films like Lives of Others, or Le Carré is the master of that kind of moral grey area, isn't he? Like Spy Who Came In From the Cold, and those kind of films, I think, are really good at charting the kind of murkiness. Nothing is easy. Millions of people are going to die in the years immediately after these moments, and the choices, there are no easy choices, which I think is what the film is about. But what is the individual responsibility in those moments. So, there's films like Bridge of Spies, I think, is a great and interesting film about those kind of questions. But particularly the kind of the ones that were looking at Germany and at Berlin, and that kind of atmosphere of Weimar into Nazi Berlin, and quite how that was going to manifest in our story were the kind of things I was thinking about.
Now, when you're adapting a book like this, what were the most challenging elements to adapt, and how did you solve those problems?
And the hardest thing is that he's written a 300 and something page book, which is really tightly constructed, not just in terms of plot, but in terms of sort of the detail and the building up of historical detail. And so, the necessity of abbreviating and essentializing that and cutting it and finding a shape for it, particularly finding a shape which felt, the one thing we were kind of clear about was that we didn't want to just make an accurate but potentially dry historical drama. Like, we wanted to maintain and activate and even potentially heighten the thriller elements of the book, and really try and create something that had a sense of propulsion, which is really hard when everyone knows the end, right? Like, Paul Hartman is not going to shoot Adolf Hitler in the last. I mean, yeah. I don't know. Maybe when Tarantino does his like alternative history endings, and like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood or Inglourious Basterds, maybe he now has changed the rules so that maybe Paul could shoot Hitler in that scene, but I know he's not going to, and we all know that Chamberlain's going to resign and Churchill's going to come in and Britain's going to go to war, and there's going to be 6 years of atrocity and horror ahead. But trying to maintain the thriller elements of the book, which Robert does brilliantly. Robert writes books which are they're not genre thrillers in the Le Carré mold necessarily, but they do enough to keep his readers turning the page. Mm-hmm. And so we really wanted to keep that and heighten that. But that necessitates sometimes a slightly different shape than the book. And then you get into the difficulty of he's built his house of cards really precisely. So when you take something out, when you say, okay, we're going to merge these two characters, these two English diplomats, civil servants behind the scenes are going to get merged into one, or we're going to remove a scene where the generals, the heads of the Air Force and the Army come in and brief Chamberlain at length about Britain's lack of preparedness for war, or we're going to, change the structure of the way some information about Paul and Hughes' relationship is revealed to the audience. You make a decision, and then 2 drafts later or 2 months later, you discover why Robert structured it in the way he did, and quite how very good he is at structuring story. And then you have to go back and find a fix and a way of doing it in your new thing. But with adaptation, always it's about, I think, trying to find the truth of the material, which is not of the source material, which is not necessarily the letter of the source material, right? Sometimes you have to go quite a long way away in order to get to the heart of what something's really about. And in the case of Munich, really, there were some things that we really wanted to push our thumb on, particularly in terms of that sense. Christian always talked about making a film that felt relevant today. And actually, of course, what happened is that the film came out, and then suddenly Europe and the West found itself in a position with Russia where a lot of the same questions about appeasement, or it's quite hard to remember now, but before the invasion of Ukraine, the question about how far to go in giving Putin what he wanted was exactly the same questions. And people were talking, people in MPs were talking about Munich, about the Munich conference in Parliament in the weeks leading up to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine this year. So it became a very relevant film in a way that I don't think we obviously couldn't have predicted. But thinking about relevance, thinking about the question of what is the responsibility of every single one of us in a moment of historical crisis, and how do you, if you were alone in a room with somebody who you think of as a dangerous leader who's doing damage to things, what would you do? What could you do? Could you shoot whoever, you insert the name of the despotic populist leader of your choice, but like what would you do? And that's the question that Hugh and Paul, and to an extent Chamberlain, are wrestling, and Helen Winter are wrestling with in this film. Like what can any single person do, and how do you live with the consequences of your decisions? So trying to really articulate that in a more just in a clearer way maybe than the book does, or the book needs to, was part of the job.
It's interesting because we recorded our review yesterday in tape recording, and we spoke about that sort of parallels to now. Quite scary in that sense, how on the mark this was. And going back to the Paul von Hartmann in front of Hitler with the gun, we can say spoilers here. It's not a problem.
Okay.
People should have listened to it by this point. It's fascinating because what would you do in that situation? A lot of people would just go, "Oh yeah, I'd just shoot him," but that's not necessarily true, because you have to live your life after that.
And I think that's it's a kind of issue, I think, with representation of some of this kind of stuff on film, that people are always shooting each other so easily, and the question of the cost of, that's what Le Carré writes this so brilliantly, doesn't he? That what the cost is of pulling a trigger or betraying somebody, but particularly violence, I think. And I do believe that there are some people who, in any context, and maybe I'm one of them, in any context would not be able to shoot somebody, even faced with somebody like that. And that's that's the argument that Hugh is making in the film. It's like that we can't, if you shoot him, who are you? Like, we have to negotiate, we have to deal, we have to use all of the levers and tools of diplomacy. Otherwise we're being, he's moving us into his field of combat rather than ours, which is civilization. And that's the challenge, and that's the kind of impossible challenge that Chamberlain and Hugh and Paul are dealing with in this moment. It's like, you're always going to fail if you're, at that, really. And it's about mitigating the failure. And that's kind of bruising, but true. Yeah.
I would say, we mentioned this in the review, and credit to your writing in the sense, because I hadn't read the book. I still haven't read the book. I'm not a student of history particularly, although I know a little about Chamberlain and such from school. But I obviously know what happened to Hitler. But in that moment, I wasn't sure if your story was going to go the Tarantino route, as you said, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood or something like that, with Glorious Bastards, and I thought, well, maybe that's what's going to happen. So you've built that tension to that point, and I think that's credit to you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. I mean, that's good.
I was just going to say, in terms of the collaborative process when you're putting the script together. Now, I know, and we've spoken to quite a few screenwriters on the show, and they come in at different points of the process of making a film. Some people have it from the beginning. Some people come in, save it at the last minute. It sounds like this was your script to start off with. Yeah. Was the director there from the start as well? And was it a collaborative process, or was it really just you just cranking it out?
No, I had started, and then Christian Schwoker, the director, was attached during the process of me finishing my first draft. So then he and I didn't meet until there was a draft. So that first sense of taking the book apart and putting the beginnings of a film together, I did on my own, and then it changed beyond recognition over the nearly year of us developing it together. And that was, like I say, that was one of my favorite things about the whole process, is particularly because, there's a sense, and I think this is in the book, and certainly I brought it to the book. The British perspective on this is particular and narrow, and the Western perspective is particular and narrow, and the Western sense of what heroism was in 1939, and a sense of what victory looked like and who the goodies and the baddies were at this moment. And what was fantastic is that Christian came in as somebody who's, you know, lived like all Germans of his generation. He's lived his life defined by being the generation that came after the generation, you know, people who had been there and lived through the Second World War in Germany, and, you know, saturated with representations of Hitler and conversations about the behavior of the German people at this time. And so his determination to make something which was not cliched in the way it did that, didn't just where, you know, the Nazi characters that we met didn't just feel like all the others we've seen on film before. Particularly, I think the German people making the film felt like there was a certain way that Germans were represented in British and American films about this period that didn't feel true. And that's not about a positive gloss or anything. It's about making something that felt true rather than hackneyed. And like I say, a desire to make a film that could be watched by young Germans now, as well as young Brits, young Americans, young people from everywhere, and it would be meaningful to them. Not just something for people who love reading about the Second World War, but people who, you know, as you say, don't necessarily think of themselves as like deep history buffs, but could come to this and be taken into the personal dynamics of Hugh and Paul, and really, you know, make that feel alive. That was what he brought to it, and so everything was then defined by that. And I think Paul and Hugh really seized the film in those moments. And Chamberlain, who is, you know, I think probably when you read the book, Chamberlain feels like the central figure of the story. And I think in the film, one of the clear choices was that Hugh and Paul were going to have the story, and that Chamberlain was going to be a sort of secondary character to them, actually.
One thing, you know, you talked about how you were trying to not portray things the way they are so often portrayed, especially in, you know, Hollywood movies. I can't say I've ever seen a depiction of Hitler quite like the one in this movie. And that, you know, so much of it is driven by this very quiet intensity. I would just like to know, when you're writing Hitler in a film, at this point, there's been so many versions. How do you avoid caricature, but get across kind of the character, you know, the individual that people know so well?
It's really hard, because even the great portrayals, like, you know, Downfall or something, have now entered, you know, it's a meme. It's like, you know, like it's so familiar. And I think, you know, you could, you know, like small children could do an impression of that man at those rallies. And it's like, how do you, but then I think what was in the book, but the Hitler scenes are very, very brief in the book. And what we really wanted to explore, and it's not, and I've read lots, not just about what it's like to be in a room with Hitler, but what it's like to be in a room with Putin, or, you know, a Trump, or any kind of political figure who has charisma and energy, but maybe also some sense of danger about them. And I think what we really felt, and this again comes to the conversation with Christian and his sense as a German of what that portrayal should feel like, was trying to be truthful and surprising. And here's not somebody who shouted in one-to-one meetings, not somebody who was always bombastic or threatening or kind of violent in a blatant way, but somebody who was charming and intense, yes, but also able to get people to do what he wanted, obviously, like enormously successfully. And one of the things that we really wanted to do with the film is kind of echo what goes on with Chamberlain and Hugh in Hitler and Paul, and the sort of surprise for the younger men of the intimacy being offered by the older men. And I thought that there would be something genuinely actually more scary or more interesting than a shouting, sort of ranting, frothing Hitler, to see a Hitler who was actually asking for a conversation and was quiet, and, you know, where his intelligence and his ability to read people and desire to manipulate people in a much more subtle way was evident. Now, there's a kind of, I should just say, there's a kind of like a moral complexity to this, right? Because I think one has to be careful that one's not, you know, making him nice or charming, or because I think it's really important to be honest about the fact that this is somebody who's going to, you know, kill 10 million, be responsible for the deaths of 10 million people over the years after this moment, and have been already responsible for the deaths of many, many people. But these people are human beings, and you have to understand them as human beings. And when they're turned into monsters, they're kind of, we're sort of saved from having to confront the reality that all of these barbaric acts are committed by human beings, and that the humanizing them and making that clear and putting them in the room in a real way is a really important job, I think, both for the film and just sort of in terms of what we're doing as storytellers. But like in these moments, making it hard for Paul, because there was something being offered which was like seductive, you know. Hitler talks to him, like actually asks him when he says to him, you know the British, tell me what the British are thinking. Paul does know the British, and no one's ever asked him that, like, to use that skill. Now, he doesn't want to use it for the purposes that Hitler wants him to use it for, but he's being drawn into a conversation with somebody who is intense, and and I think the performance added to that sense of it being an unusual portrayal of the man.
It's interesting because we were talking about the portrayal of Hitler yesterday. We've recorded, but you take a shark, for instance. A shark is dangerous. You haven't got to show him chomping on a person.
Yeah, exactly.
But you could just show him in the water, and there's a sense of danger. And I think that this film plays with that in the sense of Hitler, because you know what he's capable of. We know history. Yeah. I think that's another success. Now, I was going to ask you about casting. I know necessarily it might be something you're directly involved with. I mean, were you involved in that process, or did you have actors in mind when you were creating them?
Yeah, we talked a lot about. I didn't know, with the exception of Sandra, who plays Helen Winter, I didn't know any of the German actors. Actually, I saw their work later, but Christian had worked with Janis before, and had, I think, from the very first moment he began to read the book, Christian knew that Janis would be Paul. And then, like I say, Jeremy Irons, I think, had talked to Robert Harris about Chamberlain before Robert had begun to write Munich. Like, it was, and indeed there had been a previous attempt to adapt the book for, I think, a limited TV series that Jeremy had been attached to 3 years earlier that hadn't even got to script. So that was very much, and I think when the book was optioned by Netflix, they sort of knew that they would be trying to fulfill that, to have Jeremy play Chamberlain. There was a great list of people for Hugh Leggett, of which George was always really high, and I had, because of my relationship with Sam, I had known George a bit when he was making 1917, and I knew how instrumental his performance, but also his just qualities as a person had been on getting that film made, and how Sam Mendes had been able to build 1917 around George. And indeed, George was really just the most fantastic leading actor on Munich, and learned German really fluently in sort of 8 weeks in order to be able to do the part. And yeah, it was just a total joy. So I although we didn't know specifically it would be him, that I kind of had a feeling for the kind of actor who would play Hugh. yeah, and then other people kind of came in at different times. Like,
with Jeremy Irons attached to playing Chamberlain for a long time, did he have any notes? Did he have any requests? Because he was obviously very invested in the material.
Yeah, he was, and he'd thought a lot about how to do it and what this person, who this man was, and particularly, I mean, to be honest, it was his sort of take was the same as Robert's take, so it wasn't. He didn't have anything that pulled against the book. He just wanted to lean into that intelligence, that kind of sense of the strategist, the quiet thinker, and Jeremy was particularly committed to. There's a pivotal scene in the garden when Chamberlain talks about the people who he lost in the Great War, and the sense that his pacifism, or his desire to avoid war, rather, is not something negative or passive or cowardly. It's something really active and front foot and about actually trying to save lives, and it's personal. It's really personal for him. So that was always kind of front and center, and Jeremy made sure that was front and center for everybody making the film.
Now, you mentioned this earlier when you were talking about sort of scripting it and also editing, and that there being a much longer version at one point, obviously having to chop that down in the process of doing so. And Cam and I had some questions about sort of the female characters in the film. I suppose leading us into the discussion of perhaps the edit, was there more for sort of the female leads of the film at some point?
I mean, the answer is not really. Like I would say this. I'm quite proud that there is as much, like almost all of the material that is in the film is not in the book. It's new material. The book is doing this very, telling its story, but is not as concerned as I was, and as we all were making it, that we wanted to find a proper active role for those women, and that characters like Helen, like that. I mean, they're pivotal to the plot, but they were pivotal in a kind of offstage way in the book. So we're trying to find as much space as we could, and I'm aware that it's still not enough. I would love for there to be more. There was a bit more Pamela and Hugh stuff, which I think balanced the movie out a bit more, and really made clear that what her experience of being married to him was, and why that was so challenging in a way that I think helped our understanding of him. But that sort of had to come out by necessity when you're focusing it. But no, I tried really hard to hold on to as much as I could. And those two, particularly the relationship between Helen and Paul, I think is really pivotal.
It's a tough line to walk as well, because the film has to remain somewhat, I imagine, true to the realities of the world at that point, and it was very much a male-led world, especially in the politics side of things. So it's definitely a tough thing to sort of get right, however you come at it. But then you mentioned earlier that obviously there was a much longer version at one point. I mean, is there anything that was shot that you wish was still in the final product, or something maybe perhaps that was fallen out of the drafts of the script that you were really proud of and just didn't get shot in the end?
There was a scene, what we talked about a lot was the fact that it was a shame that even though they were in a room together for a portion of the film, that there was no direct Hitler-Chamberlain interaction. And I wrote a scene that was just a completely invented scene towards the end of the conference when just before Chamberlain left to go back to his hotel, he and Hitler had actually quite a long, like kind of 3-page conversation about their respective personal histories, being through a translator, which was kind of good and made it awkward, about, what they had both done in the First World War, and Hitler sort of insinuating that Chamberlain was a coward for not having been an actual active participant in the war, and Chamberlain sort of hardening into his resolve to not allow Hitler to get away with what he was trying to get away with in that moment. And I really loved that. And I loved Hugh sort of overhearing that conversation. And in the end, it was just at a point in the film where, like I say, the balance of like thriller versus character-based drama was really vexed, because the kind of the MacGuffin of the document had just been like the hair had been released into the film, and you'd had Paul and Hugh having their sort of secret rendezvous, having walked through the streets of Munich together. So there was a pacing issue. It just held up the film at a critical moment. But I really was proud of it, and because it was again like a hard thing to write, like writing those two significant historical figures having a sort of personal conversation was a challenge and an interesting one. So yeah, maybe that would be in the screenwriter's cut if it existed.
Now, a lot of debate surrounding the movie that I've read online is about the nature of the relationship between Hugh and Paul, and that many people read a lot of intimacy or possibly something romantic there. Was that intentional? Were you looking at making this a little ambiguous when you were writing it for people to kind of take what they wanted?
I think they shared a closeness at university that I think like people who've been through those university friendships might recognize. And I think the line between the romantic relationships and the non-romantic friendships and those moments are all quite blurry. I think both of them had found something in each other that they hadn't found in other relationships, either sexual romantic relationships or not, and that they missed each other in a really real sense and were kind of needed each other in a sense. So I think all of that was inherent in the book, and all of it is manifest in the film and in the performances. And Yanis and George were incredibly close through the making of the film, and were great friends and really wanted that friendship to be active. And I wasn't trying to suggest that Paul and Hugh were lovers. I don't think that they were, in my vision, but like that it's clear that that I wanted to write about that point in your life where you form, I didn't go to university in the early 1930s and live through anything like these kind of periods, but still the friendships that I made in my like late teens and early 20s, I think of as very defining and like fixed things that are, you're going to be friends with those people for a very long time. And there's a vividness about experiences in that moment. And part of the point of the film was the contrast between how you feel 10 years later and the kind of disappointment as life has rolled out in the way it has, particularly for Hugh, versus that kind of the potential and the energy and excitement of that. We're on the verge of just starting something, and who knows what we're going to do and what we might do together. And that, you get really forged, your friendships are forged in that kind of crucible. And that's what I wanted to write about, really. And what I think is that those bits are about. So, yeah, I'm aware that people are interested in that element of the film.
Well, there's something to be said about writing a platonic relationship between men. And it's something that perhaps is a lost art at times, because it just seems that we're all just buddies with each other and nothing goes deeper in a lot of sort of storytelling, which I think is a shame, because you can have really strong relationships between men that is not romantic. It is just a platonic sort of thing. And I think another success is the connection between these two characters, which weirdly spend a lot of time apart in the film. And yet you long for them to be together.
Well, yeah, that was the great kind of narrative structural challenge, is what do you do about the fact that these, you've got essentially two trains running in parallel in story terms for the first 2/3 of the narrative. And in the book, that's kind of fine because you just move back and forwards, but we're used to that's quite hard a dynamic of story to make work on film, I think. And working out how to intercut and move between the two places and allow things like the radio broadcast to be happening simultaneously, using the flashbacks to keep that sense of them as a connected force together, so that when you get to the point where Hugh hears Paul's name again, or they see each other in the conference, that you really feel the weight of that, because the story's been driving you towards those points of connection. That's quite hard, and that was something we were looking for.
I think as we're wrapping up our chat on Munich before we sort of finish off, just looking back on the film now, what's sort of your favorite moment that you created?
I mean, there's lots of it that I'm really proud of. I love the section. It's actually nothing to do with me. It was Christian and his cinematographer and his designer. But the part of the film where Hugh, having just received the document, walks back to his hotel through Munich, and he walks through the billowing flags, and the dogs are there, and the brown shirts are there. I think they were thinking about how they could represent Germany in that moment without falling into a kind of cliche about what that looked like. And I think that whole section of the film has a kind of poetry to it, which is quite unusual and quite unexpected at that moment, and is really, I think, is really successful. And then, I love the scene between the two guys. It's sort of the climax of the film in a character sense, when after they've been in the hospital at night and they're standing outside and they're talking about what they're going to do next, and then the sort of it's twin scene in the car, the next scene where they sort of say goodbye to each other. Like, those are the scenes where I feel like we really had to try and find a way of writing what we wanted the film to be about without it feeling too on the nose. But that's I think, and they're both, the performances are fantastic. George is just wonderful in those bits of the film. So I'm very proud of those.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Calling all agents. Independent podcasting, much like the spy game, requires considerable resources, whether it's research, equipment, hosting, or of course constructing a top secret volcano lair. We're putting out the call for your support.
That's right. As you may know, we've activated the Spy Hearts Patreon, home of our ever-growing lineup of Agents in the Field episodes where we decode non-spy films from your favorite spy actors, and full film commentaries with more intel than a Basil exposition briefing.
Cam, what have we got in our crosshairs this month?
Well, the Thunderball commentary is live, and we are tackling da-dun, 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 the Pink Panther from 1963.
And if that sounds delicious, then become a true spy hard today and join the circus at patreon.com/spyhards. But before this message self-destructs, Cam, resume the spy jinx. Well, I think before we wrap up, I did just want to touch on, obviously, working with Sam Mendes, Bond being quite an important set of films to the spy world. Is there anything you sort of picked up from working with him that you'll use in your own sort of film career?
Oh, wow. I mean, like we've done now, we've been working together for so long on this play and seen it. I mean, there's a kind of, what was really interesting, I thought, about the work that Sam did on Bond, and particularly on Skyfall with John Logan, was how you push through the expected and the cliche of it to find something which is new and original, but also satisfies that need that we have, right? To when I watch it, I want to feel like I felt when I was 8 watching Roger Moore skiing off with the Union Jack parachute, and that is, and I think doing a Bond film is probably the hardest possible version of that. How you have the new whilst maintaining what somebody and you can see it in the discussion about how to cast the role. Like, how do you give people what they want, what the feeling that you want, whilst also evolving the franchise and moving the story forward and finding the unexpected. And Sam's thinking about that, and that applies to sort of everything. It's just very acutely and obviously there in something like Bond, but it's the same as the conversation we're having about Hitler or about representations of Nazis on film, or like how do you do the thing? I think that story works in our brains in a really like primal sense, and how do you trigger those electrons in our brain that make us feel a certain way when we hear a classic story. And that, the thing about there only being 7 narratives, that everything is kind of, in the end, comes down to some really essential myths as human beings. How do you deliver that and at the same time surprise and make something new? And that's the great challenge of making anything, I think. But that's where Sam and his collaborators, particularly on Skyfall, which I think is just the most brilliant movie, like push into that. So you get what you want, but you also get something you didn't know you wanted, maybe.
I think it's a fair answer, and I would agree when it comes to Skyfall, which I think brings us beautifully over to the final set of questions that we have for every guest. From John, Glenn, Nicholas Meyer, you're all going to get these questions. So you're in the hot seat now. We need to check your spy credentials.
Oh God, okay.
What is your favorite spy film?
I haven't seen it for a long time, so I'm slightly nervous about saying this because I'm not going to be able to talk about it in huge detail. But I remember the feeling I had watching The Conversation and feeling like, and I watched it, I didn't know anything about it, and I watched it and I felt utterly, I think Hackman's performance in that film is unbelievable. And just the sense of, I just loved everything about it. I thought that it had a kind of an atmosphere and a claustrophobia and a tightness of story of all of its own that I should watch it again because I really, really love that film. And then, like, obvious ones, I think Richard Burton in the 65 Spy Who Came In From the Cold is really great. And Le Carre, the master of all of that.
I think you're the first person to answer with The Conversation. So I think you
really? That's good. Okay.
I think so.
I think so.
Yeah,
which is a surprise, kind of, actually.
Yeah, you hear the Spy Came From the Cold quite a bit. North by Northwest comes up a couple of times, things like that.
Maybe The Conversation doesn't count as a spy movie. Maybe that's why.
Oh, it
counts.
I don't know. It counts. So we give it the thumbs up, so it counts. Therefore,
Right.
Apparently we're the guardians of this realm. So
yeah. You say what you say goes. That's good. Okay,
it's terrifying.
I don't want this responsibility. No. Well, speaking of your connections with Bond and your love of Bond growing up, what's your favorite Bond film?
Oh wow, that's a good question. I love. This is also going to be an unusual answer. I grew up with Roger Moore, so like that has a special place. But I think Timothy Dalton is a fantastic, underrated Bond, and I love Living Daylights. I think that's a great movie.
I just see where you go with that. If you go for License to Kill or Living Daylights, I actually prefer Living Daylights out of the two, so I think that's a good choice.
Oh, thanks.
I'm still waiting for him to come back and do another, like a third Bond, an older Bond, and
Bond. Why not? My God, it's great.
They tried it in Never Said Ever Again. They didn't really do it very well, but
no, I feel like that was done for maybe not the best reasons, but I feel like that would be, if they announced that Timothy Dalton is the new Bond, that would be a surprise announcement, I think.
Well, you've got like Russell T Davies coming back to Doctor Who. You can
great,
do
exactly.
Like.
There's loads of precedent. Okay, great.
Yeah. Last question before we let you go.
Yeah.
Your love of Bond is well cemented. Your spy credentials have been passed. It's all good. We're rubber stamping you. What do you do with the Bond franchise moving forward?
Oh God. Okay. I mean, I'm not going to answer that. I don't know that. They'll do it. The thing is, the only person who knows what they should do and will do the right thing is Barbara Broccoli, who I just trust completely. So you just got to wait and see what Barbara does. And like, it's a family business. Like she knows,
Mm-hmm.
And though you've just got to wait and see. I wouldn't dare to imagine anything else.
I almost want to twist your arm, but I know I've got a lot of time left. So before we let you go, Ben, is there anything you're working on at the moment you can sort of spoil for us or let us know you've got things coming up?
No, there's a few things around. There's not actually very much I can talk about, but I'm back in the Second World War actually for another project, for a TV project, and all of my experience on Munich and everything that we've been talking about has been really useful for that. Because I feel like, as we discussed, looking back at these moments in history is the way of really understanding where we are today and talking about it in a kind of indirect but but helpful way. So no, I'm back in 1939 at the moment, and it's good.
Okay, well, we'll be keeping an eye out for that. But
Yeah,
again, Ben, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you.
Thanks, Scott. Thank you both. It's fantastic.
Fantastic. There you go, folks. That was our chat with Mr. Ben Power, and very busy man. His Lehman Trilogy is getting tons of accolades right now. He did that with Sam Mendes, of course, and very thrilled that he could take the time to talk to us.
Yeah, this was a really fascinating interview. I love when we have writers on, especially writers who are so eloquent in explaining not just the process of how, their words wound up on the screen, but also just the nature of storytelling. Like, this was someone who'd clearly thought through every element and just had so much insight about every aspect of this movie we asked him about.
Yeah, it's one of those interviews where I wish I had like another hour just to really dig into the film and dig into sort of the background, because he comes from a playwriting stage background, and how that influenced the process of making this script. You can tell he thought a lot about it, and I thought his insights, it actually reminded me a lot of the sort of Dan Mindell interview in a way.
Yeah.
Or it's kind of like a film school in an interview, because if you're listening to this and you're thinking about being a screenwriter, there's some interesting tidbits in there about the process of creating and adapting characters, what you should and what you shouldn't put across. I mean, when we spoke about this film earlier this week, we had some questions we wanted to take, and we took them to Ben, and he gave us as good an answer as you could get, really.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that he was so open with just discussing some of the things, we took issue with. We talked about, the female characters in the movie, and he had some really interesting insights into why they wound up the way they did on the screen. And that's something you hope, that every screenwriter, when they're talking about their work, can say, well, here's what we did, and here's why we wound up with this. All I would like to hear is, like, why, as opposed to, I don't know.
Yeah, it's nice that there's some thought put into it. And as Ben said, he actually added more time with the female characters and gave them more to do. You look back at apparently the book, which neither of us have read, they must not feature at all or barely. So I suppose credit where credit is due for giving them more time. Obviously, we would have liked more for some of the characters, but you take what you can get. And as I said to Ben in the interview, you also have to contextualize the story and where it's set. The major players in the story would mostly be men, and there's no way to. I mean, this was not trying to be a retelling of history. This is trying to be somewhat true to form. And so he had to stick inside those boundaries.
Definitely. And I was just really interested to hear him talk about the scenes of tension throughout the movie that are so effective, and especially the ones dealing with Hitler, which in our review of the movie, I said, I was really just kind of bowled over by the depiction we got in the movie and how effective it was and how it conveyed that menace. And just hearing him break down the process of bringing a very difficult character to the screen. Like, Hitler is someone who is obviously one of the great monsters of history. So you've got to walk that fine line between making him charismatic on the screen, but also not making him a caricature. And I was just genuinely fascinated listening to him kind of explain the process of how that, that depiction wound up on the screen.
And as you say, it's a really tough job to try and. Well, you're not going to try and reinvent the wheel, but you can portray it in a different, interesting way without betraying what we know to be true. And, much as I made jokes in the episode about the guy looking like three small children in a Nazi uniform, which I still stick to, I think it's entirely correct.
Yeah.
I think that is more like he looks diminutive. Like, he looks like this sort of Napoleon small man energy, trying to act out, and this sort of cult of personality, trying to manipulate people around him. And it's interesting that all this stuff is sort of layered in this film without being too sort of loud about it. Like, it's just there. And if you are looking for that depth, that exists within this film. But if you're also just looking for a film about a story in World War II, you can just sort of look at it that way too.
Yeah, like, the movie is not, you wouldn't call it pretentious storytelling. It's not kind of that beating you upside the head with its messages. It's, kind of this somewhat immersive experience of just going on a mission at a very tense time pre-World War II and kind of soaking up in the, just the atmosphere and the characters at this central drama. It's not a overbearing film at all, and I think that's one of its real successes.
And I quite enjoyed hearing about sort of Jeremy Irons' connection to Chamberlain and wanting to do that character before even the Robert Harris book had been created. He clearly has a passion for that person in British history. I don't know. I mean, I came down on sort of the side of historians and in the review, and I mean, I wasn't there. I can't speak to Neville Chamberlain's thought processes in what he did. I just go, I suppose, with the consensus. But I suppose as an actor, it's a fascinating role because it's someone who has been portrayed in one way throughout history, but you can perceive his actions in a different way, and that's, I guess, probably one of the things that made him so interested in the character. And I wonder if there's some sort of through line between his interest in the character, consulting with Robert Harris, and then being in this film. Obviously, he was wanting to be in the TV adaptation that was potentially going to happen before this. I imagine there's probably other other examples of actors being attached to characters that they're really passionate about in their careers and eventually getting to play them. I couldn't list them off the top of my head, but I just find that interesting as a choice for an actor who, his name is cemented in film history. He doesn't need to do the biopic on Neville Chamberlain.
No, and I think, as you said, like, historians are pretty split, pretty polarized on, this story, not just talking about the movie, but the book as well, in terms of reframing Chamberlain. But in some ways, that's what makes this movie stand out from the rest of the pack, is that it offers that insight that's never really been delved into. So I guess it's sort of up for debate, but it's not a bad thing if a movie inspires debate.
No, I'd rather we be talking about this than, well, my favorite spy.
True, my favorite spy. And it's funny, when you were talking about actors being attached to roles for a long time, you know what the one that popped to my mind? It shows how classy and refined I am in my tastes.
I daren't ask, but go on.
Channing Tatum for Gambit.
Oh. Is that something he's been championing?
He was attached to play Gambit for a long time in an X-Men film when it was still owned by Fox.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fat. I suppose I could see it. I don't know what his Bayou accent would be like.
We'll never know. I believe that's where he was born, though. Like, I think he was actually born in New Orleans, so that's why he was so passionate about the character.
I totally get it then, if that's the case. It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. Weird side journey we've gone on, but nonetheless.
Yeah. Mon chéri. Well, yeah, and I suppose, like, in just sort of like encapsulating our chat, I think it's clear to me, and we've spoken to a lot of screenwriters on the show, and I'm not going to name names of who is who, but there's some people that we've spoken to, or people we've discussed on the show, that it's really just been a job in between jobs.
Sure.
Writing this script for this film. I feel like Ben took this assignment seriously and wanted to add as much as he could. And I think he did a bang-up job of adapting the book. I can't speak to the book as a whole, and I can't say it's necessarily a good adaptation of the book, but I think the script that he delivered kept me captivated for 2 hours, and I think the sense of tension is rife throughout. I think it's a success in that sense. So credit to the man. He clearly had a lot of passion about it, and that shows.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what you hope for. I mean, not every project is going to be every, person attached to its dream project. But clearly this was a project that meant something to him, and that came across in the interview. And I do think it comes across in the movie. Yeah,
absolutely. And just speaking of sort of Ben and his spy credentials, obviously, like, working with Sam Mendes is fascinating. I think, again, I could have spoken to him another half an hour or so about that. I mean, maybe I'll have to get Sam's email off of Ben and see if we can get that SpyMaster interview set up. That would be a hoot. But what a man to work under when it comes to films, and also the connection to 1917 as well, for the Hugh Leggett character, George McKay. And I just think that's like a fascinating way of learning film, because the work that Sam did, especially with Skyfall, and trying to not only push the envelope but make it feel nostalgic, because that Skyfall was a very pivotal film for Bond. It's probably the most pivotal since Goldeneye, I think I would argue.
Yeah, Casino Royale was pretty important in reinventing the brand, so I would say that's a pretty pivotal one.
I think there is an argument for that. I think Skyfall penetrated more like markets than Casino Royale did.
That's accurate, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that Sam was able to stick that landing, although we haven't reviewed it yet, so I won't go into my thoughts on the film of Skyfall. But just to be around Sam and to talk about Bond with Sam whilst he was in the process of making Spectre, that must have been absolutely fascinating.
And I would imagine Sam Mendes was probably aging before him, because Spectre's process of development was very rough.
Yeah, I don't know how much fun he had on Spectre as opposed to Skyfall, but if what Ben is saying is any gauge, then he was still passionate about trying to make it a good film.
For sure.
That's all I suppose you can say from that. And of course, Ben's favorite spy film was The Conversation, which is not something we've heard before in terms of being someone's favorite. There's been a lot of Casino Royales, but I appreciate a different answer to the question. We've not tackled this film or the spiritual successor, Enemy of the State, on this show, but we are looking forward to tackling them at some point.
Yeah, The Conversation is, something of a masterpiece, at least in my eyes. So I was excited to hear that one mentioned, but I was really excited to hear him say that his favorite Bond movie was The Living Daylights. I don't think we've ever had anyone say The Living Daylights before.
No, actually, I suppose you're right. It's interesting because a lot of people we've spoken to, and like yourself, really as well, just from years of speaking to you, like you grew up in that Roger Moore era,
yeah.
But then really it didn't sort of reignite for you until sort of Goldeneye came along.
That's right, yeah.
So Brosnan was sort of the next big one for you, because Dalton sort of suffered from the 15 rating of License to Kill and not the best reception to Living Daylights. So it's fascinating that actually as a kid he went straight for Living Daylights and really sort of stuck to that film.
Yeah, and for me, I think my relationship with Dalton was different because I watched him, The Living Daylights and License to Kill in the midst of watching Roger Moore films. It wasn't like I watched all the Roger Moores and then went to Dalton. It's like I was watching Roger Moore and having such a fun time, and then I bounced to the serious guy, and I'm like, give me back the fun guy, and then watched some more Roger Moore, and then another Dalton, and bounced back and forth. So I wonder how I would have received those movies had I watched all the Roger Moores and then the two Daltons in a row.
There's no crocodile submarines in these films. Why am I watching them?
Exactly. I say that to every single movie, though.
That's your criteria for the knock list, basically.
Pretty much, yeah. It's all crocodile subs all the time.
But yeah, again, I want to thank Ben for taking the time to talk to us today. Nothing but generous with his time. And it's been a blast talking about Munich, The Edge of War.
Yeah, for sure. This was a lot of fun, and this was our first Netflix film, and hopefully down the road we can find another Netflix film that's interesting to talk about and perhaps has a good SpyMaster interview potential attached to it.
Absolutely. So I think, Cam, the question is now, what are we talking about next week?
Well, Scott, we are belatedly wrapping up the Bourne franchise. We covered those movies a little while back, but we never did a proper roundtable the way we did the Brosnan era of Bond films. So we are going to do that finally. We are going to tackle the entire Bourne series and talk about every aspect, the best, the worst, everything.
Yes, the Brosnan roundtable was kind of like a trial episode in a way for us to see what you guys thought about it, and it's been one of our most popular episodes altogether, so I get the sense that some people like listening to that sort of style. The Tuesday after this episode comes out marks the 20th anniversary of the release of The Bourne Identity, so we thought that was a great sort of convergence of just Bourne and sort of our opportunity to go back and do a roundtable for a different, not James Bond, but a different sort of franchise. And I think we will look to do this for other franchises down the road, that once we've maybe done all of the films, maybe give it a year or so, we'll go and sort of reapprise it as a whole with some experts. And we've got a great roundtable of experts. I won't spoil who we've got. You'll find that out on social media or when you listen next week. And we also have a lot of returning guests from our Bourne reviews who are coming back to give their thoughts on the Bourne legacy, if you will, as a whole. And yes, it's going to be a really fascinating episode, slightly longer than our usual. And we will also have a SpyMaster interview for you next week that I won't spoil. But let's just say you might need a pen.
I like it.
There you go, folks. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to tune in next week and listen to our Bourne Round Table. If you liked what you heard this week on the SpyMaster interview, please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us when it comes to being searched on these sort of podcast aggregator websites, or just tell your friends, because that also helps too. And do not forget to follow us discreetly on social media at SpyHards. That's SpyHards on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. But until next week, listeners, you can only play the game with the hands that you've been dealt.
Hello, my name is Chris Carr, I'm a filmmaker and podcaster. Join me as I take a look at the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and organised crime on my podcast, Secrets and Spies, available on all podcast apps.
This is manna from spy heaven.